What happens when the person you trust most becomes the one you should fear? Imagine this picture-perfect family. A routine weekend hike in one of America's most beautiful national parks. And then, nothing. Complete silence. For people vanish into thin air, leaving behind a community devastated and a search operation that yields absolutely zero answers. For 12 years, Montana's Glacier National Park held a terrible secret. A mystery so baffling that investigators eventually had to walk away, chalking it up to nature's unforgiving power. The official story? A tragic hiking accident. The family simply got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But what if I told you that the mountains weren't the killer at all? What if I told you that one member of the Whitaker family survived? Not by luck, but by design. And what if I told you that when the truth finally emerged in 2021, it would reveal not a story of survival against the elements, but a story of calculated, cold-blooded betrayal that would shock an entire state. This is the story of how a cold case that seemed impossible to solve was finally cracked wide open by a grandmother's relentless determination, a hunter's trail camera footage, and a hidden wedding ring that screamed the truth from beneath a cabin floorboard. The arrest would send shockwaves through the community, because the person responsible wasn't a stranger lurking in the wilderness. It was someone the victims trusted completely, someone who shared their tent, their meals, their last moments on Earth. This cold case solved stands as one of Montana's most disturbing investigations. And it all started with a family who just wanted to enjoy the beauty of Glacier National Park. Let me introduce you to the Whitaker family. Because before they became a headline, before they became a mystery, they were real people with real lives, real dreams, and real love for each other. Daniel Whitaker, 35 years old in the summer of 2009. A local contractor who built homes throughout the Flathead Valley region. Friends described him as the kind of guy who'd show up with his toolbox if you mentioned a leaky faucet. Solid, dependable, the type of father who coached Little League on weekends and never missed a school play. Daniel had grown up in Montana. These mountains weren't just scenery to him. They were in his blood. He knew how to read weather patterns, how to navigate by landmarks, how to respect the wilderness. His mother had made sure of that. His wife, Rachel Whitaker, was 33, an elementary school teacher at Kalispell's Edgerton Elementary. Parents loved her. Kids adored her. She had this gift for making every child in her classroom feel special, feel seen. She organized the annual school camping trip, led the environmental club, and spent her summers volunteering at literacy programs. On the surface, Rachel and Daniel seemed like Montana's ideal couple. High school sweethearts who'd built a life together. They'd been married for 9 years by that summer. Then there were the twins, Ivy and Ren Whitaker, 7 years old, and already showing the adventurous spirit of true Montana kids. Ivy was the bold one, always climbing higher, running faster, pushing boundaries. Ren was quieter, more observant, with a love for drawing wildflowers and collecting interesting rocks on family hikes. The girls were obsessed with their grandmother's stories. Stories about bear encounters, about reading animal tracks, about surviving in the backcountry. They'd beg her to teach them everything she knew. And that brings us to the heart of this family. Eleanor Whitaker. Everyone called her Ellie. At 62 years old in 2009, Ellie was a legend in northwest Montana. She'd spent 30 years as a Glacier National Park ranger before retiring. But retirement for Ellie didn't mean slowing down. She taught wilderness survival courses. She led backcountry expeditions. She was the person search and rescue teams called when they needed someone who truly understood the mountains. Ellie had raised Daniel alone after her husband died when the boy was just 8 years old. She taught him everything. How to build shelter. How to find water. How to read the sky for incoming weather. How to respect the power of nature while not fearing it. This made the upcoming trip feel routine, almost boring in its familiarity. The plan was simple. A 2-day family hike to the high country along the Glacier Peak Trail. Nothing extreme. A trail Daniel and Ellie had hiked dozens of times. They'd camp at one of the established backcountry sites, enjoy the views, teach the twins about alpine ecology, and return home by Sunday evening, August 14th. It was supposed to be a memory-making weekend. Quality time in a place the family loved. The last conversation Ellie had with her son was on Wednesday evening, August 12th, just before they set out. Daniel called to confirm the route, the expected weather, the emergency protocols. Everything was by the book. Everything was planned. Daniel's last words to his mother were, "Don't worry, Mom. We've got this. See you Sunday night for dinner." Those would be the last words Ellie would ever hear her son speak. The Whitaker family departed Kalispell early on Thursday morning, August 13th, 2009. They checked in at the Glacier National Park Ranger Station at 7:45 a.m., as required for overnight backcountry permits. The ranger on duty that morning remembers them clearly. A happy family, well-prepared with proper gear and supplies. The weather forecast was good. Clear skies predicted through the weekend with only a slight chance of afternoon thunderstorms, typical for August in the Montana Rockies. For the first day, everything went exactly according to plan. At 2:15 p.m. that afternoon, Ellie received a text message from Daniel's phone. It was a photo. The family at Summit Ridge Lookout, exactly where they should be at that time based on their planned route. All four of them smiling. The twins holding up peace signs. Rachel with her arm around Daniel. Beautiful mountain vistas stretching behind them. The text read, "Made great time. Girls are loving it. Weather perfect." Ellie saved that photo, looked at it, smiled. Her family was having the adventure they'd planned. Then, at 6:37 p.m., another message came through from Daniel's phone. Weather turning faster than expected. Moving to lower elevation campsite. Might lose signal. See you Sunday. Love you. For an experienced outdoorsman like Daniel, this was standard protocol. Mountain weather changes rapidly. When conditions shift, you adapt. You move to safer ground. You prioritize safety over sticking to a predetermined plan. Ellie texted back, "Smart call. Stay safe. Check in when you can." The message showed as delivered, but there was no response. Ellie wasn't worried. Not yet. Signal in the backcountry is notoriously unreliable. Sometimes messages go through. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes you're in a dead zone for days. Friday passed. No word. But that was expected. Saturday came and went. Still silence. But the family wasn't due back until Sunday evening. Sunday, August 16th. That's when the alarm bells started ringing. Ellie arrived at the trailhead where Daniel had parked their vehicle at 4 p.m., expecting to see her son's truck pulling in after a successful trip. The parking area was empty except for Daniel's Ford Ranger, sitting exactly where he'd left it 4 days earlier. By 6 p.m., with no sign of the family and the sun starting to descend toward the ridgeline, Ellie's instincts kicked into high gear. She tried calling Daniel's cell phone, straight to voicemail. She tried Rachel's phone. Same thing. This is where Ellie's decades of experience in search and rescue took over. She didn't panic. She acted. At 6:45 p.m., Ellie contacted the Glacier National Park Dispatch Center and reported the family as overdue. She provided their exact planned route, the coordinates of their intended campsite, a detailed description of their gear, and Daniel's cell phone number for possible GPS tracking. The National Park Service takes overdue hikers seriously, especially when the report comes from someone like Ellie Whitaker, whose judgment they trusted completely. By 8 p.m., as darkness settled over the mountains, a preliminary search team was assembled. But before the first searchers could even reach the trailhead that night, nature intervened in the worst possible way. At 9:23 p.m., weather stations across northwest Montana registered a sudden, dramatic drop in barometric pressure. A freak weather system, completely unpredicted by forecasters, was rolling in from Canada. By 10 p.m., the mountains were engulfed in what would later be described as one of the most intense August snowstorms in Glacier National Park's recorded history. Visibility dropped to zero. Temperatures plummeted into the 20s. Winds exceeded 60 miles per hour. The storm dumped nearly 2 feet of snow in the high country overnight. The search was immediately suspended. It was simply too dangerous. Putting rescue teams into those conditions would have meant risking more lives. Ellie spent that night in the ranger station, listening to the wind howl, watching the snow pile up, knowing her family was somewhere out there in that maelstrom. When dawn broke on Monday morning, the mountains were transformed. What had been late summer green and brown was now buried under a thick blanket of white. And somewhere under that snow, for members of the Whitaker family had vanished without a trace. The moment conditions allowed, the search operation launched in full force. This wasn't a small effort. This was one of the largest search and rescue operations in Glacier National Park's history. By Monday afternoon, August 17th, more than 80 personnel were involved. National Park Service Rangers, Flathead County Search and Rescue Teams, volunteers from throughout Montana, helicopter units, K-9 tracking teams. Everyone who could help was mobilized. The operation was coordinated by Chief Ranger Marcus Brennan, a 20-year veteran who'd overseen dozens of successful rescues. But even Brennan would later admit that this case felt different from the start. The first priority was the family's planned route along Glacier Peak Trail. Searchers hiked every mile of the primary path, calling out names, looking for any sign of a campsite, any evidence that the family had passed through. Nothing. Helicopters with thermal imaging equipment scanned the ridgelines and valleys, looking for heat signatures that might indicate survivors. Nothing. The K-9 units, brought in to track scent, couldn't pick up any trail. The overnight storm had simply erased everything. Every footprint, every scent marker, every potential clue was buried under snow or washed away by the torrential rain that followed. Search teams expanded their perimeter. They hiked secondary trails, explored off-trail areas where the family might have taken shelter, checked every backcountry cabin and emergency shelter within a 10-mile radius of the planned route. Still nothing. Days turned into a week. The massive search continued, but the window of survival was closing. Even with Daniel's experience and skills, exposure to the elements in that storm would have been catastrophic. By August 25th, 9 days after the family's disappearance, the harsh reality was setting in. The official search area covered over 200 square miles of some of the most rugged terrain in North America. The Whitakers could literally be anywhere, or nowhere that searchers could reach. Lead investigator Detective Sarah Chun from the Flathead County Sheriff's Department began constructing timelines and theories. She reviewed every piece of evidence they had, which was frustratingly minimal. The last confirmed sighting was at the Summit Ridge Lookout, based on the photo Daniel had sent. That put them approximately 8 miles into their hike at 2:15 p.m. on Thursday. The second text message about weather concerns came at 6:37 p.m. If Daniel had continued hiking after the photo, moving toward lower elevation as he indicated, where would he have gone? Detective Chun mapped out every possible alternative campsite, every shelter location, every logical decision point. Search teams were redirected to these new priority areas. They found nothing. Then came the question that started to haunt the investigation. Was it possible the family had somehow gotten off trail? Completely disoriented? For an experienced hiker like Daniel, especially one trained by Ellie Whitaker, getting that lost seemed unlikely. But the storm could have created confusion. Panic could have set in, especially with 2 young children in dangerous conditions. Search teams expanded even further into the wilderness, now covering areas that seemed illogical but couldn't be ruled out. By early September, 3 weeks into the operation, resources were being stretched thin. The decision was made to scale back the active search to a smaller core team while maintaining aerial surveillance and keeping all trails monitored for any signs. Ellie refused to leave the park. She hiked every day, sometimes alone, sometimes with volunteer teams. She knew these mountains better than anyone. If her family was out there, she would find them. But the mountains kept their secret. Theories began to emerge, none of them good. Theory 1. The family had been caught in the open when the storm hit. Hypothermia could have set in rapidly. They might have succumbed to exposure, their bodies now buried or in remote locations where they simply hadn't been found yet. Theory 2. An avalanche. The storm's heavy, wet snow on steep terrain could have triggered a slide. The family could have been buried instantly, their remains potentially not recoverable until the following spring thaw, if ever. Theory 3. A fall. The mountains are full of cliffs, drop-offs, and dangerous terrain. In poor visibility and deteriorating conditions, one wrong step could have been fatal. None of these theories felt right to Ellie. She knew her son. She knew how he thought, how he responded to danger. Something wasn't adding up. By October, as the first heavy winter snows began to fall, the official search was suspended. The Whitaker family was reclassified from missing persons to presumed deceased. The case remained technically open, but practically speaking, it went cold. The official Park Service report concluded that the Whitaker family had likely perished due to environmental exposure during the unexpected storm of August 16, 2009, and that recovery of remains would potentially occur during future backcountry operations if their location was ever discovered. For the community of Kalispell and the broader Flathead Valley, the tragedy became a cautionary tale. The mountains don't care how experienced you are. Nature is unpredictable. Even the best-prepared families can fall victim to circumstances beyond their control. Memorial services were held in late October. Hundreds attended. The elementary school planted a tree in Rachel's honor. Daniel's contracting company established a scholarship fund for the twins. But there were no bodies to bury. No closure. Just an aching absence and unanswered questions. For Ellie Whitaker, the case was anything but closed. Let me tell you what it's like to live with a mystery that never gets solved. For most people, the Whitaker disappearance faded from daily conversation by the end of 2009. It became a story people mentioned occasionally, a sad reference point when discussing hiking safety, a reminder of nature's power. But for Ellie, every single day was consumed by the search. 2010 came. Spring thaw arrived in Glacier National Park. Ellie was there, hiking every trail as snow melted and exposed the landscape. She carried photos of her family, showing them to every backpacker, every ranger, every person she encountered. Had anyone seen anything? Any gear? Any sign? Nothing. Summer of 2010. The season when the family had vanished. Ellie retraced their exact planned route on the anniversary date, August 13th. She stood at Summit Ridge Lookout, the same spot where that final photo had been taken. She tried to see what Daniel might have seen, tried to understand what decisions he might have made. The mountains offered no answers. By 2011, most people had accepted the official explanation. Tragic accident. Wrong place, wrong time. Move on. But Ellie couldn't move on. Wouldn't move on. She spent her retirement savings funding private search efforts. She hired private investigators who specialized in missing persons cases. She consulted with forensic experts who analyzed weather patterns and probability models. Every lead was pursued. Every theory examined. There was the hiker who thought he'd seen a torn piece of fabric matching the description of Rachel's jacket near Avalanche Lake. Search teams investigated. It was from a different brand entirely. There was the hunter who reported finding a child's shoe in a remote drainage. It was recovered and analyzed. Wrong size, wrong style, not connected to the case. There was the psychic who claimed to have visions of the family near a specific rock formation. Ellie, desperate enough to try anything, hiked to the location. Nothing there but stone and sky. Years passed. 2012, 2013, 2014. The case file at the Flathead County Sheriff's Department grew thicker with Ellie's persistent inquiries and follow-up reports, but no closer to resolution. Detective Sarah Chun, who'd led the initial investigation, had long since moved to a position with the FBI, but she still took Ellie's calls, still listened to the theories, still felt the weight of the unsolved case. Chun would later say that Ellie Whitaker was the most determined person she'd ever encountered. Most families, after a few years, reach a point of acceptance. They find a way to move forward. But not Ellie. Ellie's friends worried about her. She'd become consumed by the search. She barely slept. She'd lost weight. Her entire life revolved around finding answers. Some people called it denial. Ellie called it refusing to quit on her family. By 2015, 6 years after the disappearance, something shifted in Ellie's approach. She started focusing on what didn't make sense rather than what did. Daniel's last text message about weather concerns. Ellie had reviewed meteorological data from that day dozens of times. Yes, A major storm system hit that night. But at 6:37 p.m., when Daniel sent that message, weather conditions were still relatively stable. Satellite data showed the storm front was still hours away. Why would Daniel, who could read weather patterns as well as any ranger, claim conditions were deteriorating when they weren't yet? The photo from Summit Ridge Lookout. Ellie studied every pixel. Everyone looked happy, relaxed, not concerned. The sky in the background was clear. So what changed in the 4.5 hours between that photo and the text about weather problems? And here's what really bothered Ellie. The planned campsite was only 2 more miles from Summit Ridge, an easy hike even with children. Daniel would have reached it by 4 p.m. at the latest. So why was he still sending messages about changing plans at 6:37 p.m.? These inconsistencies gnawed at Ellie. But without any physical evidence, without any new leads, she was stuck. 2016, 2017, 2018. The cold case grew colder. But sometimes, in the most unexpected ways, cases that seem impossible to solve suddenly break wide open. Sometimes the answer has been there all along, captured by technology, waiting in digital storage, unnoticed and unremarked upon. Sometimes it just takes one person reviewing one piece of footage at exactly the right moment to change everything. And that's exactly what happened in 2021. Cal Jennings was not a professional investigator. He was a lifelong Montana resident, a hunting guide, and an amateur wildlife photographer who loved documenting the natural world. Starting in 2019, Cal had invested in a network of remote trail cameras. These weren't for security purposes. They were purely for wildlife monitoring. Cal wanted to document bear movements, track elk migrations, capture footage of wolverines and mountain lions in their natural habitat. He'd positioned about 20 cameras in remote locations throughout the greater Glacier National Park ecosystem, including areas technically outside the park boundaries in the adjacent national forest lands. The cameras were motion-activated and equipped with long-lasting batteries and substantial memory cards. Cal would check them a few times a year, downloading footage, reviewing hours of video, cataloging interesting animal behaviors. Most of what the cameras captured was exactly what you'd expect. Deer grazing, birds landing on branches, the occasional exciting footage of a bear or mountain lion. But one camera, positioned in an extremely remote valley that Cal called Dead Man's Drainage, because of its treacherous terrain and isolation, had captured something else entirely. In March of 2021, Cal made his semi-annual trek to collect footage from his cameras. The Dead Man's Drainage camera was the most difficult to access, requiring a strenuous 10-mile hike through challenging terrain. Cal only checked it once or twice a year because of the effort involved. When he finally reached the camera and downloaded its contents, he had footage spanning nearly 18 months. Hours and hours of video to review. Cal typically fast-forwarded through most footage at high speed, slowing down only when he saw something interesting. Days and nights blurred by. Animals came and went. And then, in footage timestamped August 19, 2009 at approximately 11:30 a.m., 3 figures appeared on screen. Cal stopped the playback, rewound, watched again. 3 human figures, moving through the frame, clearly visible despite the camera's angle. An adult woman, 2 small children. They appeared to be in distress, moving slowly. The children were clinging to the woman, but they were alive. 3 days after the Whitaker family had vanished. 3 days after the storm, in a location that was miles away from any of the official search areas. Cal's heart rate accelerated. He enlarged the footage as much as the resolution allowed. The woman's clothing matched descriptions he vaguely remembered from the Whitaker case. Dark jacket, light-colored pants. The children, 2 girls. The right age. Could it be? Cal immediately checked his records. That camera was positioned at coordinates that placed it roughly 15 miles southeast of the Whitaker family's planned route, in an area so remote and treacherous that it had never been included in the search grid. An area that required expert-level wilderness skills just to access. Why would they be there? How would they have gotten there? Cal packed up his gear and started the long hike back to his vehicle. The moment he had cell signal, he called the Flathead County Sheriff's Department. His call was transferred 3 times before he finally reached someone who understood the significance of what he was reporting. That someone was Detective Sarah Chun, who had returned to Montana in 2019 and was now working cold cases for the department. Chun listened to Cal's description, asked specific questions about the footage quality, the timestamp, the location. Then she said the words Cal would never forget. "We need that footage. Immediately. And we need you to show us exactly where that camera is located." Within 48 hours, the Whitaker cold case was officially reopened. But before the investigative team could mobilize, protocol required them to verify the footage authenticity and analyze what it showed. Cal provided the original memory card, maintaining chain of custody. The video was examined by forensic specialists who confirmed it had not been edited or manipulated. The timestamp data was authentic. Frame-by-frame analysis began. Facial recognition software, though limited by the footage quality and angle, suggested a high probability match for Rachel Whitaker and the twins. But here's what was crucial. The footage showed 3 figures, not 4. Where was Daniel? The footage was only 12 seconds long. The figures entered the camera's detection zone, moved through it, and exited. They appeared to be following an animal trail or drainage, moving in a direction that led deeper into the backcountry, away from any established trails or roads. Geographic analysis of the camera location revealed something significant. Within a 2-mile radius of that spot, property records showed a single structure, an old Forest Service cabin dating back to the 1960s. The cabin was on maps, but it was listed as decommissioned and structurally unsound. It wasn't supposed to be habitable. It wasn't supposed to be accessible. Most importantly, it had never been checked during the original search operation because it was so far outside the perimeter and officially uninhabitable. Detective Chun pulled up satellite imagery of the cabin's location. The terrain around it was brutal. Steep slopes, thick forest, multiple creek crossings. It would take an expert to reach it safely. But Chun knew one expert who could make that journey without hesitation. Ellie Whitaker. When Chun called Ellie to inform her about the trail camera footage, there was a long silence on the phone line. 12 years. 12 years of searching, hoping, refusing to give up. And now, finally, concrete evidence that at least 3 members of her family had survived the storm. Ellie's first question was immediate and direct. "How fast can you organize a search team to that location?" Chun explained the challenges. The area was remote. Weather conditions at that elevation in early spring were still unpredictable. They needed to assemble the right personnel, prepare proper equipment, coordinate with the Forest Service. It would take at least 72 hours to launch properly. Ellie's response would define everything that came next. "I'm not waiting 72 hours. I'm going now." Detective Chun tried to convince Ellie to wait for the official search team. From a law enforcement perspective, having civilians, even experienced ones, entering a potential crime scene was problematic. Because yes, at this point, the case had officially shifted from missing persons to potential criminal investigation. The question everyone was asking, if Rachel and the twins had survived and made it to that cabin, why hadn't they sought help? Why hadn't they triggered any of the emergency beacons that exist throughout the park? Why hadn't they walked out to civilization once the weather cleared? And most critically, where was Daniel? The geographic analysis raised disturbing possibilities. The location where Cal's camera had captured the footage was not along any logical path from the family's last known location to safety. In fact, it was in the opposite direction. You don't accidentally end up 15 miles off course in terrain that challenging. Not unless something very wrong had occurred. Chun assembled her investigative team. Along with the search and rescue coordination, she brought in Special Agent Marcus Webb from the FBI's Violent Crimes Unit. Webb specialized in cases involving harm to family members. Together, they developed multiple scenarios. Scenario 1. Daniel had been injured or killed in the storm, and Rachel had been trying to reach help with the children but became disoriented, eventually finding shelter in the old cabin. Scenario 2. The family had encountered someone else in the wilderness. A violent encounter had occurred, and Rachel had fled with the children to hide. Scenario 3. Something had happened within the family unit itself. That third scenario was the one no one wanted to consider but couldn't ignore. Statistically, when family members go missing under mysterious circumstances, investigators have to look at family dynamics. Chun pulled every record related to the Whitakers: financial records, medical records, school reports, social media histories, looking for any indication of problems, any red flags that might have been missed. What she found was a family that looked perfect on paper. No financial stress, no history of domestic issues, no concerning behavior patterns. But Chun had been investigating crimes long enough to know that what appears on the surface isn't always the truth beneath. While the official team prepared for a coordinated search operation planned for April 2, 2021, Ellie Whitaker was making her own preparations. At 74 years old, she was still in remarkable physical condition. She'd never stopped hiking, never stopped training. The mountains were her domain, and she knew them better than any GPS system. On the evening of March 31st, Ellie loaded her pack with supplies: emergency shelter, high-calorie food, first aid equipment, communication devices, navigation tools, everything needed for a solo backcountry operation. She studied the topographical maps one more time, memorizing the route to the coordinates Chun had provided. The journey would be grueling. She estimated 12 to 14 hours of hiking through difficult terrain. She could do it. She had to do it. At 4 a.m. on April 1st, Ellie began her hike. She didn't tell anyone she was going. She knew they'd try to stop her. She left a note for Detective Chun, explaining her intentions and apologizing for not following protocol. The note ended with, "If they're there, they've waited 12 years. I won't make them wait another day." Ellie's route took her through sections of wilderness that few humans had traversed. She crossed ice-cold streams swollen with snowmelt. She navigated around steep cliff faces. She pushed through dense forest where no trail existed. Her decades of experience showed in every decision. She read the landscape like a book, choosing the safest paths, conserving energy, moving with purpose. By late afternoon, she was approaching the coordinates where Cal's camera had been positioned. She found the camera itself, still mounted to a tree, and paused for a moment, knowing this device had captured the evidence that changed everything. From that point, she had approximately 2 more miles to the cabin's suspected location. The terrain grew even more challenging. The sun was descending toward the western peaks. Shadows lengthened. Temperature dropped. Ellie pressed on. At 7:45 p.m., just as twilight was fading to darkness, Ellie saw it. The cabin. It was exactly where the property records indicated, nestled in a small clearing beside a creek. From a distance, it looked abandoned, decrepit, barely standing. But as Ellie moved closer, her trained eyes noticed details that didn't fit the narrative of an unused, forgotten structure. Fresh wood stacked against the exterior wall. A recently maintained path leading to the creek. Windows that, while dirty, weren't broken. And most telling of all, a thin wisp of smoke coming from the chimney. Someone was inside. Ellie's heart hammered in her chest. She approached slowly, carefully, every sense alert. She was 50 feet from the cabin when the door opened, and Rachel Whitaker stepped into the fading light. For a moment, neither woman moved. They simply stared at each other across the distance. Rachel looked dramatically different from the woman in the family photos. Thinner, harder. Her hair had grayed significantly. She wore layered clothing that looked like it had been improvised from multiple sources. Ellie found her voice first. Rachel. Just the name. Nothing more. Rachel's expression was difficult to read. Surprise, certainly, but something else. Something that looked almost like resignation. Ellie, I didn't expect you. Where are my granddaughters? Where's Daniel? At the mention of Daniel's name, something flickered across Rachel's face. The girls are inside. They're safe. Daniel. She paused. Daniel left years ago. Went for help. Never came back. The words sounded rehearsed. Hollow. Ellie took a step forward. Years ago? Rachel, it's been 12 years. The entire state searched for you. We thought you were all dead. The storm, Rachel said. We got separated from our route. Daniel was injured. We found this cabin. He recovered enough to try to hike out, but he never returned. I had to protect the girls. I had to keep them safe. Every word Rachel spoke triggered alarm bells in Ellie's mind. The story didn't make sense. If Daniel had left to get help and never returned, wouldn't Rachel have tried herself once the girls were older? Wouldn't she have attempted to signal passing aircraft? Wouldn't she have done something, anything, to contact the outside world? I need to see Ivy and Wren, Ellie said firmly. Rachel hesitated, then nodded. Of course. They'll be so happy to see their grandmother. She turned to go back into the cabin, but Ellie noticed the way she positioned herself, always keeping Ellie in her peripheral vision. Defensive body language. Inside the cabin, the scene was simultaneously better and worse than Ellie had imagined. The structure was indeed habitable. Someone had made significant repairs and improvements. A wood stove provided heat. Shelves held supplies. It was clearly set up for long-term occupation. And there, sitting on makeshift beds, were two teenage girls who had been 7-year-olds when they vanished. Ivy and Wren Whitaker, 19 years old now, alive. The reunion was surreal. The girls recognized Ellie, but their memories of her were distant, filtered through 12 years of isolation. They were polite but uncertain, looking to Rachel for cues on how to respond. Ellie's professional training overrode her emotional response. She needed to understand the situation before reacting. She asked questions, gently at first. What had happened on the hike? How had they ended up here? How had they survived? The answers came primarily from Rachel, with the girls offering only brief confirmations. The story remained consistent with what Rachel had said outside. Storm, Daniel injured, sheltered in cabin, Daniel left for help, never returned, survival mode. But Ellie's instincts were screaming that something was profoundly wrong. The girls' behavior was off. They were subdued, didn't make eye contact, seemed almost afraid to speak without Rachel's approval. And then Ellie noticed the cabin's layout. Only 2 beds. Supplies for 3 people, not 4. Everything suggested that this had been a 3-person living situation for years. Where was any evidence that Daniel had ever been here? Ellie decided to shift tactics. She started talking about specifics, about Daniel's skills, about how he would have handled various survival scenarios, about the decisions he would have made. And she watched Rachel's reactions. That's when Ellie saw it. A brief micro-expression when Daniel's name was mentioned. Not sadness, not concern, guilt. Ellie excused herself to step outside, claiming she needed to contact the authorities to report that she'd found them. Rachel didn't object but also didn't let Ellie take either of the girls with her. Once outside, Ellie did try to use her satellite communication device, but the signal was weak and unreliable in the valley. She'd have to hike to higher ground. But before she did that, she needed to search the area around the cabin. Years of law enforcement training guided her actions. She walked the perimeter, looking for anything unusual, any signs of disturbance, any evidence of what had really happened. Behind the cabin, she found a small vegetable garden, overgrown now in early spring but showing signs of cultivation from previous years. Near the woodpile, she found tools, a well-maintained axe, a saw, implements for survival, and then, underneath a loose board on the cabin's exterior wall, hidden in a gap between the logs, Ellie found something that changed everything. A ring. Not just any ring. Daniel's wedding ring. She recognized it immediately. It was a unique design, custom-made. A band of tungsten with a narrow inlay of elk antler, representing Daniel's love of Montana wildlife. He never took that ring off. Never. Ellie stood there, holding the ring, and the truth started to crystallize in her mind. This wasn't a survival situation. This was a crime scene. Ellie quietly pocketed the ring and returned to the cabin. She needed to be strategic. She was alone, miles from any backup, with a woman who had potentially done something terrible to her son. But she also needed to get the twins to safety and find out what had really happened. When she entered the cabin, Rachel was preparing a simple meal. The girls were quiet, sitting together on one of the beds. Ellie made a decision. She would confront Rachel directly, but she needed the girls to be safe first. "Rachel, I need to speak with you outside. Privately." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "Because I found something, and you're going to explain it to me." The tension in the cabin became palpable. Ivy and Wren looked up, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Rachel stood slowly. "The girls stay inside." "Fine." Outside, with the cabin door closed, Ellie produced the ring. "Want to tell me why my son's wedding ring is hidden in your wall?" Rachel's face transformed. The mask of the survivor, the grieving wife, the protective mother, all of it fell away. What remained was cold, calculated. "You should have waited for the official search team, Ellie." And that's when Rachel attacked. The assault was sudden and brutal. Rachel grabbed a piece of firewood and swung it at Ellie's head. Ellie's reflexes, honed by decades of ranger work and wilderness encounters, saved her life. She partially dodged, but the wood still connected with her shoulder and the side of her head. She went down hard, vision blurring, pain exploding through her skull. Rachel was on her immediately, hands around her throat, pressing down. "You couldn't leave it alone," Rachel hissed. 12 years, and you couldn't just let them stay dead." Ellie fought back. At 74, she wasn't as strong as she'd once been, but she was fighting for her life. She clawed at Rachel's face, drove a knee upward, tried to break the chokehold. Inside the cabin, the girls heard the commotion. Wren screamed. The distraction was enough. Rachel's grip loosened for just a second, and Ellie managed to roll, breaking free. Both women scrambled to their feet, but Ellie was injured, bleeding from her head wound, disoriented. Rachel picked up the firewood again, advancing. That's when Ivy burst out of the cabin door. "Mom, stop. What are you doing?" Rachel spun toward her daughter. "Get back inside. This doesn't concern you." But Ivy didn't move, and in that moment of hesitation, Ellie saw her opening. She launched herself at Rachel, tackling her to the ground. They struggled, rolled, fought desperately. Ellie managed to grab Rachel's wrists, pinning them. She was on top, using her body weight, but she could feel consciousness slipping away from the head injury. "Ivy," she gasped. "Rope. Cabin. Get me rope." The teenager stood frozen, shocked by the violence, by the unraveling of everything she'd been told for 12 years. "Ivy, now!" The command in Ellie's voice, the ranger authority, broke through. Ivy ran into the cabin. She emerged with a length of cord, the kind used for securing supplies. Together, with Ivy's help, they managed to restrain Rachel. But Rachel wasn't done talking. "You want to know what happened to Daniel?" Rachel spat. "Fine, I'll tell you. He was weak. He wanted to go back. After everything I'd planned, everything I'd prepared, he wanted to turn around because the girls were tired. Can you believe that? After I'd worked so hard to get us out here, to get us away from that suffocating life, he wanted to quit." Ellie stared at her, horror growing. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I did what I had to do. I drugged his water at lunch. By evening, when we were far from the trail, he was disoriented, confused. The storm was the perfect cover. I led him to a cliff edge and I pushed. Simple. Clean. He fell into a ravine so deep they'll never find his body. You killed my son. I freed myself from him," Rachel screamed. "From the boring, predictable life. From the expectations. From everything. I had it all planned. The cabin was stocked. I'd been preparing for months. We were going to disappear, live free, live on our own terms." "You murdered their father," Ellie said, her voice breaking. "You took them from their lives. You're insane." "I'm the only one who had the courage to escape." Ellie looked at Ivy and Run, both standing there, hearing their mother's confession, their faces showing shock and disbelief. "Ivy, Wren, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Ellie said. "Go inside the cabin. Gather any warm clothes you have. We're leaving. All of us. We're going to walk out of here." But Ellie's injuries were severe. She could feel blood running down the side of her face. Her vision kept blurring. She wasn't sure she could make the 12-hour hike back to civilization. She needed help to come to them. Ellie managed to activate her emergency beacon. It was a device all rangers carried, capable of sending a distress signal even in areas with no cell coverage. The signal went out, but help was hours away at best. And that's when things got worse. Rachel, despite being restrained, started laughing. A hollow, chilling sound. You think you've won? You think you're going to walk out of here and tell everyone what happened? That's exactly what's going to happen, Ellie said. No, it's not. Rachel nodded toward the cabin. I've been preparing for this possibility for years. Gas canisters. Rigged. One spark and this whole place goes up. Ellie's blood went cold. She looked at the cabin where the girls had gone back inside to gather their things. You're bluffing. Am I? You want to risk their lives to find out. Ellie rushed to the cabin door, threw it open. Ivy! Ren! Get out! Get out now! The girls emerged, confused, frightened. And that's when Ellie smelled it. Natural gas. Faint but unmistakable. Rachel hadn't been bluffing. The cabin was a bomb waiting to explode. Somewhere inside, Rachel had indeed set up a system, probably with a slow leak that would eventually reach ignition concentration near any spark source, like the wood stove. They had minutes, maybe less. Ellie made a split-second decision. She grabbed Ren, the closest twin. Run. That direction. Don't stop. Don't look back. Ivy hesitated, looking at her mother, bound on the ground. Ivy, run! The girls took off into the woods. Ellie turned back to Rachel. Every instinct told her to leave this woman here, to let her face the consequences of her own trap. But she couldn't. Despite everything, she couldn't. She began cutting Rachel's restraints. Why? Rachel asked, genuinely confused. Because I'm not like you, Ellie said. She freed Rachel and pushed her toward the woods. Go. Now. Rachel stumbled away, disappearing into the darkness. Ellie started to follow, but her injuries caught up with her. She collapsed, consciousness fading. The last thing she remembered was the sound of an explosion behind her and heat washing over her back. When Ellie woke, she was in a hospital bed in Kalispell. 48 hours had passed. Detective Chun was sitting in a chair beside the bed. The girls. Ellie's first words. Safe. They're safe. You got them far enough away. Rachel. In custody. She didn't get far. Search teams found her within 6 hours. Ellie closed her eyes, relief flooding through her. You saved their lives, Ellie. You saved your granddaughters. I should have saved my son. Chun took her hand. That wasn't your fault. There was nothing you could have done. But what you did do, you brought justice. You brought those girls home. And you made sure Rachel will face every consequence of what she did. The trial of Rachel Whitaker began 8 months later, in December of 2021. The charges were extensive. First-degree murder of Daniel Whitaker. Attempted murder of Eleanor Whitaker. Kidnapping of minors Ivy and Ren Whitaker. Child endangerment. And a host of other related charges. The prosecution was led by Montana Attorney General Samantha Torres, who had personally requested the case. It had captured statewide attention, and Torres understood the significance. The defense attorney, a public defender named Marcus Klein, had an impossible task. The evidence against Rachel was overwhelming. Her own confession witnessed by Ellie and the twins. Forensic evidence from the cabin. Financial records showing Rachel had been purchasing supplies and equipment in the months before the trip. Digital evidence showing she'd been researching the remote cabin location. But the most damaging evidence came from the twins themselves. Ren Whitaker took the stand. At 19 years old, she was articulate, composed, and heartbreakingly honest. She testified that she remembered the night her father died. She was only 7, but the memories had never faded. She remembered her mother giving her father water from a special bottle. She remembered him becoming confused, slurring his words. She remembered her mother leading them all away from the trail, deeper into the wilderness. And she remembered, years later, finding her father's wedding ring in her mother's possession and watching Rachel hide it in the cabin wall, telling the girls to never speak of it. Ren testified that she'd tried, multiple times over the years, to escape, to get help, but Rachel had always caught her or threatened that if they left, authorities would never believe their story and they'd be separated forever. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation and control. Ivy's testimony corroborated everything. She spoke about the isolation, the indoctrination, the constant fear, how their mother had convinced them that the outside world had forgotten them, that no one was looking, that this was their life now. The forensic evidence included an analysis of the cabin's propane system. Investigators confirmed that Rachel had indeed rigged it to leak, and that the explosion would have been catastrophic if Ellie hadn't gotten the girls out. Expert witnesses testified about the timeline, the weather patterns, the logistics of Rachel's plan. Every piece of evidence pointed to extensive premeditation. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't an accident. This was calculated murder. The defense's strategy was to argue mental illness. Klein brought in psychiatrists who testified that Rachel showed signs of severe personality disorders, possible psychotic breaks, diminished capacity. But the prosecution countered effectively. They showed that Rachel had been functional, strategic, and fully aware of her actions. She'd planned for months. She'd executed her plan with precision. She'd maintained the deception for 12 years. That's not the behavior of someone who's not in control of their mental faculties. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. When the verdict was read, Rachel showed no emotion. She simply stared straight ahead, as if she'd expected this outcome all along. But in the gallery, Ellie sat with Ivy and ran on either side of her, tears streaming down all their faces. Not tears of joy. How could there be joy when Daniel was gone, when 12 years had been stolen? But tears of relief, of validation, of justice finally being served. Sentencing occurred 6 weeks later, in February of 2022. The courtroom was packed. Media from across the country had descended on Montana to cover the conclusion of this extraordinary case. Judge Patricia Morrison presided. She was known as a fair but firm jurist, and she'd been visibly affected by the testimony during the trial. Before sentencing, the judge allowed victim impact statements. Ellie Whitaker was the first to speak. "Your Honor, members of the court, I stand before you as a mother who lost her son. Not to the mountains I love, not to an accident or an act of nature, but to the deliberate, calculated actions of someone he trusted completely. Daniel was my only child. I raised him alone after my husband died. I taught him to respect the wilderness, to understand its beauty and its danger. I taught him to be capable, competent, and careful. But I never taught him to fear the person sleeping beside him in a tent. Rachel Whitaker took my son from this world and then continued to take from us every day for 12 years. She took my granddaughter's childhood. She took their innocence. She took their father's memory and twisted it into lies. But she couldn't take everything. She couldn't take their resilience. She couldn't take our determination to find the truth. And she couldn't take the justice that we're here to see served today. Daniel believed in the good in people. He believed in second chances and redemption. But I believe he would also believe in accountability. I ask this court to ensure that Rachel Whitaker never has the opportunity to harm another family the way she harmed ours." Ivy and Ren also gave statements, standing together at the podium, holding hands. They spoke about their father, about the memories they still had of him, about the 12 years of childhood they'd lost, about the struggle to reintegrate into a world they barely remembered. They spoke about their mother and the complicated feelings of loving someone who had done something unforgivable. And they spoke about their grandmother who had never stopped searching, never stopped fighting, never stopped believing they were out there somewhere. When they finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. The defense had nothing to add. Rachel had refused to speak on her own behalf. Judge Morrison reviewed the case files one final time, then delivered her sentence. "Rachel Whitaker, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of first-degree murder, attempted murder, kidnapping, and numerous related charges. In my 30 years on the bench, I have seen many cases of violence, many instances of betrayal. But few have demonstrated the level of premeditation, manipulation, and callous disregard for human life that you have shown. You murdered your husband in cold blood. You stole your children's childhood. You attempted to murder a woman whose only crime was loving her family enough to never give up searching for them. The law provides guidelines for sentencing, but it also provides judges with discretion to account for the unique circumstances of a case. This is such a case. For the murder of Daniel Whitaker, I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the attempted murder of Eleanor Whitaker, I sentence you to an additional 25 years, to run consecutively. For the kidnapping charges, an additional 20 years to run consecutively. You will spend the remainder of your natural life in the custody of the Montana Department of Corrections. You will never again walk free. You will never again have the opportunity to harm another person. May you spend that time reflecting on the pain you've caused, though I suspect you lack the capacity for such reflection. This court is adjourned. Rachel Whitaker was led out of the courtroom in shackles. She never looked back at her daughters. Outside the courthouse, media swarmed. Detective Chun gave a brief statement praising Ellie's determination and the collaborative work of multiple agencies. But Ellie declined to speak to reporters. Instead, she left with Ivy and Ren, 3 generations of women who'd survived, who'd fought, and who would now have to find a way to heal. The Whitaker case sent ripples through law enforcement communities nationwide. It highlighted the importance of never truly closing cold cases, of maintaining evidence, of following up on new leads no matter how much time has passed. Within Montana, the case led to significant changes in backcountry search protocols. All decommissioned Forest Service structures are now cataloged with precise GPS coordinates and included in search grids, no matter how remote or supposedly uninhabitable. Trail camera footage from private citizens is now actively solicited during missing person investigations. The Montana Department of Justice even created a portal where outdoorsmen and wildlife enthusiasts can voluntarily register their camera locations so they can be checked during searches. The case also sparked conversations about psychological profiling in missing persons cases. Could Rachel's intentions have been identified earlier? Were there warning signs that were missed? Retrospective analysis of Rachel's life before the disappearance revealed some subtle indicators. She'd been unhappy in her marriage, though she'd hidden it well. She'd made comments to acquaintances about wanting to disappear and start over, but they'd been dismissed as idle fantasy. She'd been researching survival techniques and remote living for over a year before the trip, but that had seemed consistent with her role as an elementary school teacher who ran camping programs. In isolation, none of these things were alarming. Together, they painted a picture that, in hindsight, was chilling. The case became a teaching example at the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. A reminder that family annihilators, people who murder their own family members, don't always follow predictable patterns. For the outdoor community, the case was a sobering reminder that not all dangers in the wilderness have fur and claws. For Ellie, Ivy, and Ren, the years following the trial were about rebuilding. The twins had to catch up on 12 years of education, socialization, and life experience they'd missed. It was an overwhelming challenge. They underwent extensive therapy, both individually and together, processing the trauma of what they'd experienced, what they'd witnessed, what they'd lost. Ivy struggled with anger and trust issues. Ren battled depression and anxiety. But they had Ellie, and Ellie had them. They moved into a house together in Kalispell, close enough to the mountains to feel connected to Daniel's memory, but far enough from the wilderness to feel safe. The community rallied around them. Anonymous donors established trust funds for the twins' education. Employers offered Ellie consulting work that provided income while allowing her to be present for her granddaughters. Slowly, painfully, they began to heal. Ivy eventually pursued a degree in criminal justice, inspired by the investigators who'd worked their case. She wanted to help other families find answers. Ren became an artist, using painting and sculpture to process her experiences. Her work, often featuring themes of isolation and survival, gained recognition throughout Montana. Ellie continued to hike, but never alone, always with the girls. They would talk about Daniel, sharing memories, keeping his spirit alive in the mountains he'd loved. On the anniversary of finding the twins, they would hike to a memorial they'd established at a safe, accessible location in Glacier National Park. A simple plaque with Daniel's name, his dates, and the inscription, "Forever in the mountains he loved." The Whitaker case became one of Montana's most discussed cold cases solved. But for the family at its center, it was never just a case. It was a father and son taken too soon. It was childhood stolen. It was trauma that would never fully heal. But it was also perseverance, determination, the refusal to accept that someone you love is truly gone without proof. It was a grandmother who wouldn't give up, community that wouldn't forget, investigators who wouldn't let the file gather dust. Detective Sarah Chon, who'd worked the case from the beginning, would later say, "The Whitaker case taught me that cold doesn't mean unsolvable. It just means waiting for the right piece of evidence to emerge. And sometimes that evidence has been there all along, captured by technology, stored in memory, hidden in plain sight. We just have to be patient enough and persistent enough to find it." The case file, now officially closed, sits in the Flathead County Sheriff's Department archives. It's been requested by law enforcement agencies nationwide as a teaching tool. But more importantly, it stands as a testament to a truth that families of the missing cling to. No case is ever truly cold as long as someone keeps searching. No disappearance is ever truly forgotten as long as someone remembers. And justice, though sometimes delayed by years or even decades, can still be served. The story of the Whitaker family is one that stays with you long after the verdict is read and the courtroom empties. It challenges our assumptions about safety, about trust, about the people we think we know. We want to believe that evil is obvious, that dangerous people look dangerous, act dangerous, announce their intentions. But Rachel Whitaker was a beloved elementary school teacher, a soccer mom, someone parents trusted with their children's education and well-being. And she was a calculated murderer who planned her husband's death with meticulous precision and showed no remorse even when caught. The duality is uncomfortable. It's disturbing, but it's real. This case reminds us that every cold case represents a family still waiting for answers. Every unsolved disappearance is a wound that never quite heals. Every missing person is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's sibling. For 12 years, the Whitakers were a statistic. For people presumed dead in a hiking accident. A tragic story, but one that seemed to have a logical explanation. It took one grandmother's refusal to accept that explanation to uncover the truth. If you take anything away from this story, let it be this: trust your instincts. If something doesn't feel right about a missing person case, even years later, speak up. Share what you know. Provide any evidence you might have, no matter how insignificant it seems. Cal Jennings' trail camera footage seemed like it might be nothing. Just 3 figures passing through a remote area. But it was the key that unlocked an entire case. Your observation, your photograph, your memory might be the piece someone else needs to finally find answers. Montana's wilderness is vast and beautiful and unforgiving. Glacier National Park welcomes millions of visitors each year, and the overwhelming majority have safe, amazing experiences. But Daniel Whitaker's story reminds us that we need to be aware not just of natural dangers, but of the people we travel with, of behavior that seems off, of situations that don't quite add up. If you're planning backcountry trips, take the proper precautions. File your plans with authorities. Carry emergency communication devices. Check in regularly. And trust your gut if something feels wrong. For Ellie, Ivy, and Ren Whitaker, the journey isn't over. Healing from this kind of trauma is a lifelong process. But they face it together, with the strength that comes from surviving the unimaginable and emerging on the other side. Daniel Whitaker is gone, but he's not forgotten. His daughters carry his memory. His mother ensures his story is told. And his spirit remains in the mountains he loved, a reminder of both the beauty and the fragility of life. This case, this cold case solved, stands as a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of never giving up, and the reality that justice, though sometimes delayed, can eventually be served. If you have any information about unsolved cases in your area, cold cases that have haunted your community, mysteries that have never been explained, remember that your tip could be the one that brings someone home. Your information could be the breakthrough a family has been waiting years, even decades, to receive. Don't underestimate the value of what you know. The Whitaker case was solved because multiple people contributed pieces to the puzzle. The hunter with trail cameras, the investigators who never fully closed the file, the grandmother who never stopped searching. Each piece mattered. Each person made a difference. You can make a difference too. The mountains of Montana keep many secrets. But this time, because of determination, technology, and an unbreakable family bond, one of those secrets was finally revealed. One cold case was solved. One family, though forever changed, found a measure of peace. And one murderer will spend the rest of her life behind bars, never again able to hurt the people she should have protected. That's justice. Imperfect, incomplete, but justice nonetheless. Thank you for listening to this story, for bearing witness to the Whitaker family's tragedy and their triumph, for understanding that behind every cold case is a human story of loss, love, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Until next time, remember, no case is ever truly cold, and no family should ever have to search alone. This has been the story of the Glacier Park betrayal, a Montana cold case solved, an arrest that shocked a community, and a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous wilderness isn't in the mountains. It's in the human heart.